Hey, what's up guys? Today I'll show you a science fiction horror film, The Girl with All the Gifts. Spoiler ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with Melanie counting how long she can hold her breath. In the middle of her counting, she hears the loud alarm of the sergeant knocking on the doors and telling them to transit. Melanie knows the drill. She wears her orange uniform and sits on the provided wheelchair with straps on it. Melanie's bedroom door opens, and soldiers enter while pointing their rifles at her. Melanie greets them despite the aggressive treatment. The soldier approaches Melanie, strapping her head and ankle, and cuffing her wrist onto the wheelchair. The soldier pushes Melanie's wheelchair and joins in line with the other children strapped on a wheelchair. The line travels into a classroom for class. Dr. Selkirk enters to substitute for a while and asks the children about the periodic table basics. Melanie is knowledgeable about it, yet somehow Selkirk doesn't show care at all. Amidst the recitation, the educator shows up in class to take over. Melanie smiles at her appearance and greets her. The educator warmly smiles and returns a greet. Selkirk leaves the classroom to the educator and exits the room. Melanie asks for a story, and the other children support her. But the educator reasons someone may snitch on her for telling a story. However, Melanie says to continue a story about Greek myths because it will count as history. So the educator obliges and asks if anyone remembers the story last time. Melanie answers, Prometheus and Epimetheus. The educator thanks Melanie and continues to tell the tale. The educator narrates Pandora's box, where all the evils are unleashed due to curiosity. She mentions finding hope at the bottom of the box. The story parallels with Melanie that despite the apocalyptic event in the world, she still finds hope through naivety. Meanwhile, the militaries return the children to their rooms. Afterward, the militaries deliver a bowl of living worms in each room, including Melanie's. She scoops them up, indulging herself until she falls asleep. She counts while holding her breath once she returns to consciousness. Outside, the scientist walks to Melanie's room and asks if she has solved a logic problem. Melanie answers it, and the scientist commends her thinking. The scientist asks another problem. There's a cat in a box. It could be alive, or it could be dead. 50-50. How would you find out? Exceptional Melanie answers, open the box and look inside. But the scientist says she's not allowed to do anything to the box. Melanie then decides to wait before answering. Then the scientist writes Melanie's response as, exquisite mimicry of observed behaviors. After the little quiz, the scientist lets Melanie pick a number between 1 to 20, and Melanie decides 13. The following day, the sergeant once again alarms the halls with his loud shouts. While the soldier pushes Melanie on the wheelchair, she notices Kenny's room 13 is occupied. Then in class, Melanie finds Kenny's spot vacant. Melanie tries to listen to the educator's storytelling, but Kenny's absence distracts her. The educator diverts the class from Kenny's absence and lets the children write their own stories. While the other children find it challenging to write one, Melanie manages to write a short story in a short period. Outside, soldiers criticize the educator with disgust because of her capability to withstand being with the children. Melanie tells the class her short story, making the educator teary. The educator approaches Melanie to pat her head. Yet the sergeant barges in, shouting at the educator for violating the rules. The rule is the people in the base can't directly touch the children. The sergeant asks the educator to watch him. He spits on his arm and lets a child on the front smell it. The educator begs him to stop, but the sergeant insists. The child's nose starts to twitch and his jaw moves. Then suddenly he starts biting the air non-stop, needing to grab the sergeant's spitted arm. The back row children begin to change as well, trying to reach for the sergeant. The children are not humans, but rather hybrids between hungry and humans. They're attracted to smell and can trigger their instincts as hungry, a mindless zombie-like creature. The sergeant stops his demonstration. He applies blocker gel on his arm and tells the educator to end the class. The militaries bring back the children to their assigned rooms. The educator visits Melanie. Through the small window of the door, the educator sees Melanie still strapped in the wheelchair. She knows that the sergeant did this to Melanie, so she enters to remove Melanie's locks. While pulling her straps, Melanie smells the educator's scent. Melanie attempts to control her urge to turn and warns the educator to leave. Luckily, Melanie's left foot remains strapped, and the educator manages to rush outside, locking the door. The educator tearfully apologizes while applying blocker to her face. The educator hears Melanie growling, and she feels horrible. Meanwhile, the scientist finds a left-behind blocker on the floor beside Melanie's door. She knows someone visited Melanie because they give blocker and ratio. The scientist asks for another number, and Melanie says 4. In shock, the scientist asks if Melanie's sure, and Melanie agrees. The following day, the sergeant fetches Melanie from room number 4 to bring her to the operating lab. While traveling, Melanie sees the military base and field. Mindless hungries are trying to infiltrate behind the fences. Then, a soldier reports to the sergeant that one barrier is down at the south section, and the sergeant says to use a flamethrower. More soldiers rush to the fences to defend the base. As for Melanie, she's left in the laboratory room with the scientist and Selkirk. On the shelf, Melanie finds a brain in a jar with growing fungus labeled number 13. Melanie greets the scientist and Selkirk, then she answers that the cat in the box is clever, so it's not there. But the scientist explains it's an analogy for Melanie to understand that the cat is either dead or alive, like Melanie, who's in between dead or living. Selkirk sedates Melanie, and she and the scientist strap Melanie to the operating table. But suddenly, the educator barges in, takes the fire extinguisher, and argues she can't be part of another experiment procedure. She destroys the ringing telephone, and wants them to stop cutting open the children. But the scientist rephrases it as, they represent as children, and asks the educator to drop her weapon. When the educator disarms herself, the scientist uses pepper spray on her. Selkirk calls security, and soldiers arrive to retrieve the educator. Before they leave, the scientist explains, Melanie is the main ingredient to create a test batch of a vaccine. The soldiers leave with the educator when suddenly a siren horning alarms the whole base. The scientist insists on proceeding with the experiment, and commands Selkirk to drop the shutter. Selkirk drops the shutter near a glass window. The shutter is almost down when suddenly Hungries breaks the window and bites her. The scientist attacks the Hungries with a glass shard, but it cuts her hand. In the room, Selkirk becomes hungry, so the scientist flees the room. Hungry Selkirk can't attack her kind, which is Melanie, who's strapped to the operating table. Melanie frees herself and goes outside the field. Hungries overrun the base, devouring the soldiers' flesh. On the field, Melanie hears the educator calling her, but a soldier knocks her out in the head. So Melanie bolts to them, and bites the soldier and the other soldier. Afterward, she feels sleepy and lies down. The educator, who regains consciousness, carries Melanie. While carrying Melanie, the educator boards an armored truck escaping the base. The sergeant drives the truck, while a soldier fires a rifle onto the Hungries from the roof. Besides the soldiers, the scientist is inside as well. They flee from the base and stop at a barren. The sergeant commands the soldier to send coordinates to the beacon while they deal with Melanie. Beacon is the military's main base. The educator asks the group what about the rest of the children, but the sergeant assumes they might be dead. Eventually, the group decides to bring Melanie, but they restrain her hands and muzzle her face to be safe. She sits on the roof while the rest are inside the truck. As for the beacon, the truck's range can't reach them. The group decides to gather water at the river. The sergeant asks the surviving soldiers to apply suppressors and soft bullets to lessen blood splatter that causes the spread of infection. Unfortunately, the soldier forgets to install suppressors, attracting a small number of Hungries. While the soldiers fight off the Hungries, the scientist and the educators rush inside the truck. But for the soldier, he wrestles against one Hungry and turns into one. The sergeant kills him the moment he shows signs of turning. Because of the wrestle between the soldier and the Hungry, he accidentally shot the truck's fuel line, giving the group no choice to walk on foot towards London. In London, stagnant Hungries surround the city. Desperate enough, they blend in with the hordes by sneaking and not making eye contact. After a nerve-wracking tour from the herds, they find an abandoned ward. Inside the ward, they settle in a private room to rest. The sergeant commands the soldier and the educator to do a quick check of the ward. At the same time, Melanie stays with the scientist. Alone, the scientist checks her wound and sees it far from healing. Then Melanie asks who she is. The scientist tells Melanie her origin. It's revealed that the sergeant with armies went to cities, retrieving survivors. However, they stumbled into a hospital and found infected newborns who ate their way out of their infected mother's womb. The newborns grew up, which resulted in Melanie and the rest of the children in the base. They can reason and have partial immunity to the hungry pathogen. Melanie confesses that she doesn't want to be hungry, but the scientist says that's what she is. Late at night, the educator fails to find food for Melanie, but she manages to find clothes for her instead. The soldier eats canned food. Then he talks with Melanie, listening to her storytelling. In the morning, the group finds the ward surrounded by Hungries. Melanie volunteers to see bait outside. Before she leaves, the educator excitedly dresses Melanie in the new clothes. The group lets her go, and she eagerly explores the city. Eventually, she eats a stray cat she hunted, making herself full. Then in one of the houses, she finds a stray dog. She brings the dog outside the ward, and sets it free, so the rest of the hungries empty the street. The sergeant restrains her again and muzzles her face. He then applauds her work. The group goes to the top of the building to search for the following route. Melanie volunteers again to find the safest way. The sergeant allows her, and lends her the soldier's radio to report her findings. Eventually, she finds a street manageable to cross. The sergeant restrains her, and the group travels again. While walking, they encounter a massive fungal growth wrapped around the BT tower, like vines from piles of dried corpses. When hungries gather in one place, they turn into a forest-like tree. The fungal tower contains seed pods that, once they open, will release spores airborne that will end humankind. The scientist then notes to Melanie the spores will serve as symbiotes to her, the hybrids. The group stumbles upon the abandoned mobile laboratory, designed by the scientist and her other colleagues. Once inside, the educator searches for food, but there's none. The sergeant comes into contact beacon again after checking the truck outside. Then the soldier volunteers for a supply run. When the soldier leaves, Melanie says she needs to eat too, because she's starting to smell them. So they let her go. Outside, Melanie hunts a bird and eats one on the roof. Once complete, Melanie finds a tribe of feral hybrids like her. Melanie knows the hybrids smell the soldier's scent, despite the blocker. So she immediately runs back to the mobile lab to warn them. The scientist tells the educator that she's dying because of sepsis caused by her wound in the mobile lab. She begs the educator to at least let her sacrifice Melanie for a vaccine before she dies. But the educator denies it and leaves the scientist devastated. As for the soldier, he follows a trail of canned food, leading him into a convenience store. Oblivious to the hybrid's trap, he goes inside, where the feral hybrids devour him alive. Melanie returns to the lab and warns the group to find the soldier quickly. The sergeant radios the soldier, but unfortunately, the soldier left his equipment outside the store to squeeze between the shutters. In the middle of their contact, the beacon finally responds to their call. The beacon reports they're almost at fall, and they're evacuating any survivors left because they'll relocate. Then Melanie once again reminds them about the soldier. Eventually, the educator and the sergeant follow Melanie to the store, but when they reach inside, they're too late. Melanie explains the hybrids trapped the soldier, and so they are. Outside, the feral hybrids surround them. Melanie takes the lead, and growls at the feral hybrids. Then she wrestles against the tribe's leader, who's holding a bat. The tribe leader's bat falls off while fighting, and Melanie grabs it. She beats the tribe leader's head to death. The three of them manage to escape, while the rest of the feral hybrids gather around their leader. The three of them return, but the scientist releases propofol in the lab to sedate them. The scientist wants to dissect Melanie, but to her surprise, Melanie stands up. Melanie explains she practiced holding her breath longer than humans can. Then the scientist realizes the fungus metabolizes oxygen for Melanie. The scientist convinces Melanie to sacrifice herself, so they can create a vaccine for the educator. She adds the educator can't be safe once the seed pods open, that responds to moisture or heat. Melanie is almost convinced, until she asks the scientist if she's thinking about Melanie's kind, nor does she remember her written words, exquisite mimicry of observed behaviors, implying that Melanie and her kind are alive and not dead. Melanie leaves the lab, but the scientist follows her outside. Desperate enough, the scientist stumbles and gasps while searching for Melanie. Unfortunately, feral hybrids corner the scientist where they feast on her. Melanie sets the BT tower on fire, where the seed pods open, releasing clouds of spores airborne. The sergeant coughs loud when she appears behind Melanie. Melanie explains her actions, thus the sergeant realizes he's turning. The sergeant gives his handgun to Melanie and commands her to kill him at once. The sergeant doesn't want to turn into one, so Melanie tearily shoots him and shakily says transit, just like before in the base. In the lab, the educator wakes up and sees outside the spores fall like snow. Behind the glass door is Melanie, looking at her. The movie ends with the educator safe and sound inside the mobile lab, while surrounded by infectious air. While behind the glass wall of the lab, she brings out a whiteboard. Outside the lab are rows of children from the base, and the feral hybrids sitting together. Knowing that this is the inevitable fall of humankind and the rise of a new species, the educator speaks through the microphone, greeting the hybrids to start their lesson. Just like in Pandora's box, Melanie unleashed hope for her kind. Melanie, standing in the back row, smiles while watching things unfold beautifully for the second generation of her kind. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.